Good afternoon. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's policy forum on risks and opportunities in the Middle East after the Israel-Iran war. The recent ceasefire between Iran and Israel has opened a window for a new approach in the Middle East. But what should the U.S. aim for, building on the historic weakness of the Islamic Republic of Iran? And in order to achieve a new strategic architecture for this region, the U.S. will need to work with its friends in the Middle East and beyond. So understanding how our allies and partners see the opportunities and risks of this moment is also critical. In order to unpack these questions, we have assembled an all-star panel today. Robert Satloff is the Washington Institute's Siegel Executive Director and Howard Berkowitz Chair in U.S. Middle East Policy. Mona Yacoubian directs the Middle East program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Her 3 decades of experience on Middle East issues have included multiple posts and advisory roles across the U.S. government, including the State Department, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and the U.S. Institute of Peace. Richard Nephew is the Bernstein Adjunct Fellow with the Washington Institute and a professor at Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy. He served in multiple senior posts with the U.S. government, including Deputy Special Envoy for Iran and Principal Deputy Coordinator for Sanctions Policy at the State Department. I will moderate today's discussion. Dana Stroul, Research Director and Kassen Family Fellow here at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Before we jump into the discussion, a few housekeeping notes. If you would like to ask questions of our panelists during the event, you can enter them into the Zoom question and answer function at the bottom of your screen. If you are watching this policy forum on our website or YouTube, feel free to email your questions to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. Again, policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. Again, feel free to send your questions in. I'll read them and pose them to our panelists after the questions that I have prepared for them. With that, let's get right into it. Rob, I'd like to ask you first. The U.S. imposed ceasefire after enabling and then joining Israel's military campaign in Iran, delivered a tectonic shift in the regional balance of power. Iran no longer controls its airspace and cannot challenge Israel and the United States for air superiority or escalation dominance. Iran will be challenged to conjure the funding or resources to reconstitute its nuclear and missile programs at home or its threat network abroad. So kick us off by reflecting on this moment, what it means for the Middle East and for the U.S. role in the Middle East. And you're muted. Just unmute yourself.
So thank you very much, Dana, and I'm very delighted to be on a panel with Mona and Richard, two people for whom I have great respect. Let me make 3 broad points to answer your question. First, I think it's important to note that we are now entering a new era of interstate conflict in the Middle East. Iran's decision last year to respond to covert Israeli targeted killing operations with their own direct aerial attacks on Israel will go down as one of the turning points in Middle East regional military history, opening the floodgates for a way of war in which Iran is at a distinct disadvantage. I mean, their system is different than ours, of course, but just imagine what happened to the guy in Tehran who wrote the memo, quote, "The time has come to end decades of proxy warfare and instead launch missiles and drones directly on the lesser Satan. The result has been decimation of Iran's air defense, leaving its adversaries free to attack multiple military and political sites as will, culminating in the massive attack on Iran's nuclear facilities, into which Iran has invested more than 30 years of effort." Now, this has normalized direct interstate attacks. And this was a strategic blunder by Iran of immense proportions. All this said, when the supreme leader thinks of the fate of Saddam, of Gaddafi, and bin Laden, or more recently, the fate of Assad, Nasrallah, Haniya, and Sinwar, and he sees himself still very much alive as the supreme leader of the still very much alive Islamic Republic, he must have some sense of satisfaction that we, the Satans, did not destroy him, did not utterly defeat him. Now, maybe he's on borrowed time, like Saddam Hussein between 91 and 2003. Does he think of it that way? I don't know. It, it's clear to me that the motivation to stay alive, to fight another day, seems to have been at the heart of his very limited response to the US strikes just a few days ago. So point one is interstate conflict in the Middle East with Iran and the United States as key actors is now been normalized. Two, we now have new red lines for US military action against Iran itself. One of the tensions in US-Israel strategic relations for years was that it was assumed that the Israeli red line or their threshold for military action was lower than America's red line or its threshold for military action against Iran. By ordering US attacks on Iran's military facilities, Trump erased that gap. We now own the policy of prevention against Iran's nuclear facilities. And this has huge implications, not least for America's presence in the region, which becomes even more important militarily than it was before these attacks. If we're serious with ourselves, the bar for action has lowered considerably. Here, what do I mean? I mean that two things can both be true at the same time. The US and Israel did do massive damage to Iran's nuclear facilities, and should Iran choose to break out to a crude device, it could most likely do this in a very short period of time. And that's without factoring in the external wild card of North Korean, Pakistani, or other assistance. For 30 years, Iran pursued a policy of go big, go slow, go open, hiding in broad daylight, building thousands of centrifuges, amassing huge quantities of enriched uranium. Now there's a reasonable chance it changes tack, takes advantage of the cover of obliterated facilities, and instead goes small, goes fast, and goes secret. And with just small amounts, very quickly it could turn that into weaponized level of enriched uranium. This was an important issue before Israel attacked. Now it's an urgent issue. It's important that the Trump administration appreciate this. And lastly, in terms of sort of big picture implications, we're in a new era of US-Israel cooperation, the outcome of which is still uncertain. I mean, we long ago passed the moment when America provided Israel with the means to defend itself by itself. That age was gone years ago. The impressive coalition that was formed last year under CENTCOM's leadership that countered Iran's missile and drone attacks only confirmed the new reality that was years in the making. But the rule stood firm that Israel's offensive actions were done by itself, for itself. That has now changed too. And then it was followed by one of the most bizarre tirades of an American president in modern history, lumping our ally and our adversary in the same expletive-filled breath. What are the new ground rules for this new era of US-Israel military and strategic cooperation? We've entered terra incognita, and it's important to set some new parameters new modes of acceptable behavior very quickly. Some of this will get codified in talks over a new memorandum of understanding, but the issues raised by the US attack on Iran go deeper than just the numbers regarding US aid and assistance to Israel. It defines a new era in our relationship. So those are three big takeaways that define the moment that we're now in.
Thanks so much, Rob. Richard, I'd like to turn to you next. Rob laid out the strategic landscape and some new parameters for the era we're in. And of course, another set of challenges is what do we do going forward with respect to Iran's nuclear program? So you have published at least three pieces in the last 2 weeks, kudos to you, on the current and future disposition of Iran's nuclear program. This issue is receiving significant attention, but the debate, at least here in Washington, is stuck on dueling intelligence assessments about how much the Israeli and U.S. strikes degraded or eliminated the program and how many months it might take Iran to break out. But the more significant, urgent question is what should happen so that the world is assured that Iran will not and cannot break out. From a non-proliferation perspective, can you offer your thoughts on should we pursue negotiations and toward what end at this point in time in light of the military campaign?
Great. Thanks, Dana, very much. And it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I'm going to try and be on camera, but five people in a house on summer vacation seems to be stressing the telecommunications. So if I drop off, that's why. As I sit back and I think about what's been achieved from a non-proliferation standpoint, there has been significant damage done to the Iranian nuclear program. I don't really think there should be any doubt of that. It's pretty clear that a large number of centrifuges were damaged in the first few hours of the strike. When Natanz's power was shut off. The attacks on the facility at Fordo and other locations throughout Iran have doubtless done considerable damage to Iran's nuclear program and its ability to actually develop a breakout option that it can pursue. But the problem with this, as is always the case when you're considering, military solutions, is whether or not we can get all of the various different components of the Iranian nuclear program that could contribute to weapons. And that means we have to deal with the material, we have to deal with the expertise, and we have to deal with the equipment. And the problem is that the Iranians have spent the last several years getting their enriched uranium stockpile to the point where it can be very quickly turned into weapons grade uranium and very quickly, therefore, modified into the components for a nuclear warhead. But the problem is we don't know whether or not they've got any of that residual equipment yet. We don't know how proficient they are at weaponization related activities. And so in a military solution scenario, you're kind of hoping that you're able to continue to identify and destroy those components in time to prevent them from going down that direction. Basically, you are very much in a we must stop now each one of those potential points of progression. Otherwise, we don't have the ability to control the situation. And that's kind of where we find ourselves now. It's part of the reason why I think there has to be consideration given to a diplomatic outcome here. But of course, the moment you started dropping bombs on people, it's very difficult to get into a diplomatic outcome. And you have to be in a position to make it worth the other side's while. I think this is part of the reason why I've seen the president start to talk about sanctions relief, which would probably have to be a component of any deal in which the Iranians enter willingly. That, of course, is very jarring, to consider right now when there are open questions about what the Iranians would do with sanctions relief, when there are open questions about what a deal would potentially involve, and especially whether or not international inspectors could go back in and verify all the various different parts of the program. An example I keep using with people is imagine inspectors go in. They say to the Iranians, we would like to see the 400 kilograms of 60% you produced. And the Iranians say, it was all destroyed in your attacks at Natanz and Fordo and Esfahan. It's all gone. We would struggle, I think, to be able to verify whether or not that's true. And if you can't verify whether or not that's true from a non-proliferation perspective, I would have to continue to advise the president, well, then it's there. It's there, and it's a potentially available, feedstock for weapons. And the same thing goes with all the other various different components of the weapons production cycle. We're talking about making the material useful for weapons, components. So, a deal is absolutely something that ought to be on the table now, but we ought to have a fairly low understanding of how successful it's going to be if the Iranians haven't actually changed their perspective on nuclear weapons and on wanting to maintain an option. And frankly, we have no evidence to prove that. We have no evidence to indicate that the Iranians have decided to take a nuclear weapons option off the table. And there's a lot of good analysis, I think, that would go into suggesting that would absolutely be in their interest to do so. So, to my mind, and Patrick Claus and I put together a piece on this, what you need to do is start testing the proposition through things like writing down what the terms of the ceasefire are and trying to spell out exactly what would constitute a breach of the ceasefire from a reconstitution of the nuclear program perspective. Candidly, some of the things we're seeing today in imagery crosses my lines. We're starting to see trucks showing up at Fordo, trucks showing up at Esfahan, digging out the tunnels. Are they digging them out to go find material? Are they digging them out to do bomb assessments? Are they digging them out as part of a general cleanup operation? Has material moved? All of these are questions to which I don't know the answers. Now, I hope, and I would at least expect, that the US and Israeli intelligence services would have a little bit better sense than I sitting here on the outside. But those all have to feed in to how we look at the ceasefire, how we look at a potential diplomatic outcome, and whether or not we can really trust the outcome here. So I think we're in one of those tough spots to actually lock in whatever has been achieved through the military operations. I think you need some kind of deal because otherwise this Iranian government has to be assumed to at least be continuing to maintain an option, if not actually going down the path. But the very act of moving down the military options has made it much more difficult to both get and trust a deal once you're there. It's a very tricky set of issues to deal with, and the only way you can go through it is to identify tests, triggers, and inspection requirements that would give you some confidence as you're progressing through to some sort of longer term deal that it's actually being implemented and successful.
Thanks so much for that, Richard. Truly terrifying. Uh, Mona, in light of Rob's laydown of what the new normal is, which is direct interstate attacks, the new reality that the United States owns a policy of preventive action against Iran, and that we are in a new era of U.S.-Israel cooperation. Then Richard lays down the ceasefire needs definition, which it lacks right now. Trucks are already on site at some of the areas targeted by military strikes. We don't know what they're doing. There is no agreed upon set of parameters for tests and triggers, etc. The region is looking at all of this too and has to be nervous. So I'd like to broaden the aperture and ask you to reflect on the rest of the region after the ceasefire. And of course, President Trump announced the ceasefire less than 24 hours after Iranian ballistic missiles targeted a U.S. military base in Qatar. Even though the missile attack was defeated and no lives were lost, this event has to be a worst-case scenario for any government in the Middle East. These are governments that have invested significant diplomatic and economic capital in maintaining channels to Tehran in order to prevent blowback and retaliation inside their own countries. Residents of the region must be asking themselves, what will Iran do next if the ceasefire does not hold, especially when we don't know the rules of this ceasefire? So what do regional leaders want to see next, both with respect to the ceasefire and the potential for negotiations?
Thanks so much, Dana, and thanks to my dear friends and colleagues at the Washington Institute for including me in this really important discussion. Let me start, if I could, Dana, by just slightly reframing your last part of your question, where there's no question that direct military confrontation between Israel and Iran, specifically for the Gulf, but I would say even for the region more broadly, constitutes a nightmare scenario. No doubt about it. I think where I would push back slightly is I think in what we saw happen, which is this highly choreographed, highly telegraphed response by Iran when it attacked Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. I think actually does sort of comport with this kind of way in which the Gulf has been engaging in this rapprochement with Iran, deepening lines of communication with them. And while I think they were clearly terrified and on edge at being caught in the crossfire between the US and Iran, the way in which things went down, and it could have gone very differently, no question about that, where it was telegraphed, where there was time to evacuate the base, there were no casualties, therefore no need for a US counter response. And Qatar, of course, steps in quickly and negotiates a ceasefire. I think all of that, I think that they would sort of look to as confirmation in a way of an approach that they have been pursuing now over some many years. With that, I want to pick up exactly on Rob's points, and I agree with everything that Rob has laid down. I think this is indeed a really important moment for the region where we are absolutely seeing normalized interstate conflict. I would add to that, I think this is happening against a backdrop, I guess I'd frame it this way, of a hinge moment in the region, where we are seeing the old order of the past 2 decades vanishing and a new order emerging. And in that new order, I think the Gulf, in my view, really constitutes the new center of gravity. And what Rob described, this notion of normalized interstate conflict, I think is anathema to the Gulf and the imperatives that they have identified. So what do they want to see next? They want to see de-escalation of the conflict, which I think for them is imperative for their economic interests, which are nothing short of existential. And as a result, they're highly vested in finding some sort of way forward between the US and Iran. Some Gulf interlocutors call this an historic opportunity, but I think they're looking at this as an historic opportunity toward finding a diplomatic solution to Iran's nuclear and regional ambitions, which they are not comfortable with, let me be very clear, rather than a military solution. So in other words, has Iran been weakened enough that it will be compelled back to the table and a deal can be negotiated? I think as part of this sort of emerging order from the Gulf perspective, I would argue that they have looked at Iran as essentially a power to be integrated rather than isolated. They had pursued the path of isolation, and I think many of them felt that what they got was simply being caught in the crosshairs and did not see much payout for that. And so I think they're going to try to sort of encourage the US and Iran to return to the negotiating table. Lastly, though, I will say, I think they are also deeply concerned that the ceasefire remains quite shaky and will not hold. And as a result, I think we can see intensified efforts by these Gulf mediators, Qatar, Oman, and others, both publicly and also privately, to try to find, again, a way to develop off-ramps and a path toward de-escalation.
Thanks so much for that. Very interesting. That they see Iran as a power to be integrated rather than isolated is somewhere I'm going to ask you to expand on that in round number 2. Okay. So that was a really important set of responses from our panelists in the first round of questions, setting the table on the different perspectives and the different courses of action for different stakeholders in this new emerging order in the post-ceasefire Middle East. Now we're going to turn to programs of action. What can be done, what should be done, with an eye specifically, of course, on U.S. policy options. Richard, we're going to start with you for round number 2. So with all of the focus on the potential for nuclear negotiations between the United States and Iran, perhaps indirectly, there are still deadlines on the books related to the first Iran nuclear deal, namely the October deadline at the UN Security Council to snap back sanctions. There is also the issue of the IAEA comprehensive report that was presented to the Board of Governors in Vienna before the 12-day war, which asserted that there is no peaceful explanation for Iran's nuclear steps. Still unresolved what to be done with that comprehensive report. So, if Tehran will not negotiate or is unwilling to make concessions on domestic enrichment or letting inspectors in, then what? Can sanctions still be snapped back at the Security Council? What other levers does the United States have? What does policy look like on the other side of this?
Yeah, all the most important questions here as we think about kind of the diplomatic leverage space we have. I mean, just a couple of facts that I'll lay down first. One, the snapback deadline of October 18th remains fully in effect. That is, there's been no change to the UN Security Council's structure, the resolution 2231, and associated deadlines that were in the JCPOA. So effectively, that means, sometime in the August timeframe. I think it's reasonable if there's no other, status change to assume that if someone wants to snap back, we're going to see movement towards snapback then. It's also still the case that the United States does not have the ability to snap back unilaterally. This issue was litigated to the extent that one can litigate such things back in the first Trump administration, when the United States did not trigger snapback before exiting the JCPOA. It essentially lost the ability to do that. There are still some people who think we ought to have the ability to trigger the snapback, but the problem is the rest of the participants in the JCPOA don't agree. And so to the extent that no one agrees that you have that authority in the international legal sense, it doesn't really help you all that much. So we need functionally, the representatives of the European three, the French, the Germans, and the British, to agree that they want to trigger snapback for that to be functionally executable. So, that is out there, but it obviously means that we've got more states that are part of that discussion, and they have their own ways of looking at the Iran issue that I'll come back to in a second. We also, as a factual matter, we have a non-compliance finding by the IEA Board of Governors, but we do not have a report yet to the UN Security Council. That's not terribly unusual in this case. We did that back in 2005 too. And the agreement when we adopted this resolution at the IEA board a couple of weeks ago was that we would evaluate where we are later on in the summer. And I think the plan was, if the Iranians didn't come forward with more cooperation with the IAEA, then the European governments would bring us back to Vienna, adopt a resolution that says we're sending the file back to New York, and then have the trigger for snapback hinge against that. And it kind of made sense as a diplomatic play. It's kind of been what's been in mind, I think, since November of last year. What all has changed is, on the one hand, one of the big things that the Iranians have been threatening in relation to snapback was that they would withdraw from the NPT and they wouldn't cooperate with the IAEA anymore. Now, they've not withdrawn from the NPT yet, but they do have a piece of legislation that is now on the table that restricts significantly their cooperation with the IAEA. That practically means that inspectors may not be going to the facilities we need them to be going to look for that 400 kilograms of HEU and to see what the status is of all the various different nuclear projects. So we've already, to some extent, gotten some of the harm from the snapback piece. We've also now got a political dimension in which governments are trying to figure out what's the best foot forward to try and stop the Iranians from proceeding to nuclear weapons. Thus far, I would say the European government's been pretty consistent with U.S. and Israeli positioning on this, which is that the Iranians have violated the terms of their treaty obligations. They've given rise to all sorts of questions about their weapons intent. And so, frankly, they are agreeable to, some kind of diplomatic solution still, but they also recognize that a military approach wasn't out of bounds, is I think the safest way to say it, with differing views amongst the European three about whether or not it was a right thing to do or a wrong thing to do at the time in which it was done. Which to me all adds up to, I think the most likely scenario is that there is still going to be pressure on the Iranians to cooperate fully with the IAEA. The fact that they're restricting access now is going to contribute to that next IAEA board meeting that will probably report around to the Security Council again and probably set up the terms for snapback, even if the risk of that is the Iranians withdraw from the NPT and further restrict their cooperation with the IAEA. The real problem, just being blunt about it, is to what extent that matters. So the UN sanctions that are going to be snapped back have value from a nonproliferation perspective, both in terms of dealing with missiles and nuclear components. They actually probably have more value now post-strike than they did pre-strike, because the Iranians are going to be in reconstitution mode. And so they're going to be looking for components that would be useful to their nuclear missile programs that may have been less important from the overall trajectory of the program before the military action was there. So I think it is a reasonable thing and a sensible thing to do to try and clamp down on Iran's nuclear missile programs. Will that have an economic dimension, though? That's where I think we should have some low amount of confidence here and some healthy skepticism. The UN sanctions really didn't target Iran's economy. There were some provisions that dealt with inspections, some provisions that dealt with banks, but by and large, this is a non-proliferation set of sanctions that we and our European partners used to have more economically significant sanctions. But the US has maintained those sanctions since maximum pressure kicked off again in 2018. And you haven't seen a big resumption of European business activity with the Iranians since. Nor have you seen it really anywhere outside of places like China, India that are buying Iranian oil. So all this adds up to, you can have snapback. Snapback will have an impact, but it's going to be much more muted than it would have otherwise. And so the real impact, I think, is going to be on those programs, but that doesn't answer the question of, can we find more leverage? To find more leverage, bluntly, you have to try and clamp off on Iran's ability to export oil. And that means exporting oil to China and to a smaller extent, India. But the United States has not, under the previous administration or this one, taken the steps necessary to really clamp down on that, which includes targeting financial institutions. And so, from my opinion, the sanctions route is not going to meaningfully add a lot of pressure on the Iranians, especially not to the extent that it's going to stop them from pursuing nuclear weapons if they've decided that's the only way they can preserve their security.
Thanks so much for that. Mona, over to you to help us think through a program of action or recommendations. I'm going to build on a few remarks you made in your first set of comments. You talked about the Gulf as the center of gravity, seeing this post-ceasefire period as an opportunity to lean into diplomacy and negotiations, not more military means. You talked about a general view that perhaps now is the time for integration, not isolation. And it's actually at a moment in time when Washington is talking about integration, not isolation, but they're talking about a different country that begins with I. They're speaking about Israel. So as we look at Iran and whether or not it is willing to make any concessions, willing to change its regional behavior, which has been the center of gravity for instability in the Middle East, what specifically are the Gulf governments willing to do, both in terms of their own policy to support pushing back on or moderating Iran's problematic activities, making concessions, allowing inspectors in, the things that Richard is talking about, in order to provide assurance that they're not seeking an illicit nuclear weapon? The kinds of things that would enable Iran's integration in the region would require adjustments in behavior by the regime. What skin are Gulf governments willing to put into action, into the game, to make that a reality? And what would they like to see in terms of U.S. actions in order to bring about that reality?
Yeah, so to be clear, I think the Gulf, two things can be true at the same time. I think the Gulf is probably breathing a huge sigh of relief in terms of the ways in which Iran's ballistic missile capabilities, and frankly, over many months, its proxies have really, those capabilities have been eroded. At the same time, I do believe that the Gulf absolutely feels that the path forward is one of diplomacy and negotiation. So what kind of skin does the Gulf have in the game? Well, first, I think we've already seen them play a very important role as mediators. We've seen Oman step up and mediate between the US and Iran in a very significant way. We've seen Qatar also, even most recently, play that mediating role. I suspect that those capabilities they will continue to bring to the table, to bring to the fore, to offer themselves up, perhaps to find ways in which to, I think, incentivize Iran. So one of the things I've been struck by in conversations with colleagues from the Gulf is, I think, a real strategic shift in their viewpoint on Iran, the role of Iran, and what is in the Gulf's strategic interests. I think they saw that 2019 was really a watershed moment when Iran, through proxies, attacked a Saudi oil facility, taking Saudi oil production, 50% of it offline. This is at Abqaiq. And there was no U.S. response. And I think that was a moment in which the Gulf decided the way forward is not confrontation with Iran, but rather finding a way, as I said, to integrate, to work with Iran. I don't know that that has shifted. I don't see that calculus changing even following what's just happened. I think instead we're going to see how the Gulf perhaps think through how to further incentivize negotiations. I think the idea of, I think their feeling is that a cornered Iran is an Iran that lashes out. And again, they're the ones that pay the direct cost of the fallout. And so I think they'll be looking to provide creative paths forward, important mediating skills, maybe resources down the road, not clear, in order to try and see that reality come to a fruition. I think they are not looking to have a Middle East that is characterized by what I think, again, Rob rightly noted, as interstate conflict with, frankly, no guardrails. That, I think, is deeply, deeply concerning to the Gulf and to the rest of the region. So I think that's how you're going to see them leveraging their capabilities, both through mediation abilities, but also perhaps providing resources and other incentives down the road if things actually kind of move. But again, I think that's way down, that's way off on the horizon. I think the concerns today are really more that this current ceasefire is extremely fragile and that the region could fall back into conflict very quickly and very easily.
Thanks so much for that. Okay, Rob, the coming months and years are arguably a time of tremendous opportunity due to Iran's weakened regional position, but also peril because, as Mona said, a cornered Iran lashes out, or a more desperate regime could be less predictable and more tolerant of risk to ensure its very survival. So what are the immediate steps that you recommend the United States take? And then what is the long-term vision that we should be working toward, and how do we get there?
Well, thank you, Dana. Immediate steps and long-term vision, all in a couple minutes. Here, let's listen. As I said earlier, out of the ashes of Fordow, Iran may very well shift strategies to fast track its development of some crude nuclear device. I know I would do that if I were the supreme leader, but thankfully I have my own day job. Now, the United States has proven its willingness to take military steps to prevent its nuclearization. If we reach the conclusion that the steps that Iran is taking, that Richard outlined earlier, about checking on Fordow with the trucks and digging out, et cetera, is all part of this new fast track effort, then we may have to take another military step against Iran. Indeed, it's the second attack that would prove, both to Iran and the region, that the U.S. is not one and done. And I think that's a real fear, from this administration. I think it's a real fear out in the region that we are one and done. Now, the goal, of course, is not to have 3, 4, 5, 6 attacks. The goal is to confirm in the minds of the Iranians and everyone else our commitment to this via diplomacy. Via diplomacy. It may take another step in order to get them to the table to confirm it via diplomacy, but diplomacy should be the objective. And very clearly, we need to take our military success and translate it into political achievement. That's what diplomacy is all about. With the Iranians, using economic and diplomatic carrots that go side by side with the military tool, the big stick The goals are simple: an agreement by Iran to forswear enrichment, admit all secret sites, transfer HEU to international control, and agree to intrusive international inspections. Iran's agreement for strict limits on ballistic missiles and on drone production and the exporting of their components abroad. These are what we need from the Iranians. And we have to have the mix of carrots and sticks to achieve it. Now is when we do this. This is the moment. We cannot push this off. The mixed messaging from the administration on whether we need an agreement is wrong. We need an agreement. The agreement should be built on our commitment to use force in the absence of an agreement. But our goal should be an agreement. Now, I would just add, since you asked me about, big picture, I think we're ripe to go big on other fronts too. I think that U.S. leadership can take this moment to work with the Israelis for an end to the Gaza conflict. An end to the Gaza conflict based on the immediate release of prisoners, of all the hostages, the deportation of key Hamas leaders, phased withdrawal of the IDF to Gaza's periphery, handoff security control to joint local Palestinian and other Arab state forces, which will in turn confiscate and collect Hamas weapons. I think that is ripe for American leadership to bring about that sort of outcome. On another front, I think it's ripe for American leadership at the moment, especially having done what we did in Iran, to compel the leadership of Lebanon to swiftly fulfill its ceasefire responsibilities to disarm all militias as a top national priority. Otherwise, the Israelis are going to do it militarily, and there's a way to do this without having the Israelis doing it militarily. I don't know if people here saw what Walid Jumblat, the leader of the Druze, did over the weekend by announcing, you know what? The Israelis and the Americans won. So I'm handing over my arms to the government. We should all recognize this, he said. He said not happily, but he said that. We should be taking advantage of this moment to be compelling others in Lebanon to make this decision, and it will require the leadership in Lebanon, the new president, the new prime minister, to take action and not wait for the Israelis to do their dirty business for them. I, for one, think that the potential for Israel-Lebanon peace and normalization is actually very real. After all, there's virtually no territorial issue on that front. I know there's a lot of nice, happy talk about the potential for Syria-Israel, but let's remember, even with the best of intentions, there's something big up there called the Golan Heights that Syrians and Israelis don't agree on. So, let's get our priorities all straight. Very important for the U.S. to get the Gulf deeply engaged in helping to grease all these things. Yes, with their assets, but with their investment, with the diplomatic support, and in some cases, like with the Emiratis in Gaza, even with their people. Very important to get them engaged. At the end of this, there may very well be Saudi-Israel normalization. That I think will take some time. I can't imagine the Saudis are going to get in front of all this. They're going to want to see how these things play out, but it's still a reasonable goal. One piece of this that I did not include that was in a lot of the talk over the last 72 hours between the United States and Israel, a lot of the news reports about an agreement on principle of the steps forward, and that is I don't think that there can be a U.S.-endorsed unilateral Israeli annexation of West Bank territory as part of any of this that I've just talked about. I think people have to get real about this, that there's a choice that needs to be made. Either Arab states are going to help police and patrol Gaza, either Saudi Arabia is going to move forward incrementally with normalization with Israel, or the Israelis are going to annex part of the West Bank, namely that part that was allotted to Israel in the original deal of the century, namely the the President Trump's January 2020 abortive peace plan. You cannot have them both. It can't be both Arab states in Gaza and Israel annexing the West Bank. You need to make choices, just like the choice we made about going into Iran, a very important choice that opens a new era, takes on new responsibilities, new risks, but new opportunities. So too that choice. I think there's a big agenda out there to be done. It would require the Trump administration not to take the Middle East, stick it in a drawer now that it did Iran, and move on to other things. Actually, it will require appointments, getting confirmations, putting people in place who can actually do these jobs. There's a lot of work to be done if they want to do it. And there's a lot of glory out there to be achieved, but you have to do the hard work to achieve it.
Mona, Rob laid out several different potential agreements or actions that could make or break this moment, maybe not in the short term, certainly in the medium to long term. He talked about the potential for Israel-Lebanon peace and normalization. He noted that there was also some breathless discussion of Israel-Syria normalization. He dangled out that Israel-Saudi normalization is still on the table at some point, but the Saudis are going to watch how events unfold over the coming months and potentially years. He talked about the potential for Arab state involvement in Gaza and the risk of foreclosing Arab participation in some sort of Gaza stabilization or Palestinian governance if there is Israeli annexation of the West Bank. So I just want to turn it over to you and give you an opportunity to share views on that range of possibilities.
Yeah, I mean, I think Rob's framing of the either or is exactly right. Um, Look, again, I think the idea that the way forward is through continued military strikes and deepened military intervention, to my mind, does not yield the end state that I think everyone is looking for, which is a set of comprehensive agreements that finally bring this region out of decades of conflict and into a much brighter future. And so I think Rob is exactly right on questions around annexation and Arab willingness to participate, annexation of Gaza, of the West Bank. I do think Gaza also figures in a central way in this. There has to be a lasting ceasefire in Gaza if there is an effort or a desire to bring on board broader, Arab cooperation with Israel. Lebanon is another great example, but here again, there's another either or here. So Israel continues, and we talk about interstate conflict. Israel, though there is a ceasefire in place, continues to strike South Lebanon and even sometimes Beirut at will. That is not lost on the Lebanese. Last week marked, I think, some of the most intense Israeli military strikes on South Lebanon since the ceasefire was negotiated. So I think this notion of interstate conflict as becoming normalized, being dangerous, has to apply to all states. Yes, Iran for sure, but also Israel. And so if there is to be a way forward, it's got to be, in my view, the US in particular, that doubles and triples down on diplomacy. And here again, I agree with Rob. This is not the time to put that file away and turn towards something else. We are at a very opportune moment, but it's going to require deep diplomatic commitment, not sliding down a slippery slope toward additional military strikes and intervention, and finding ways to leverage our Arab allies and their willingness to put both their very strong mediation skills and resources behind this vision. I would argue their vision of a Middle East that is stable, that is prosperous, and that is inclusive.
Thanks. I have one question from the Zoom Q&A that I'm going to paraphrase and then turn over to each of you to offer a few thoughts. And one general theme that comes from all of your remarks is either Richard speaking about negotiations and diplomacy in the context of Iran's nuclear ambitions, or Mona and Rob in the case of doubling down on all these different diplomatic avenues to bring about a more stable order in the Middle East, requires consistency, which is challenging in an environment where, on one hand, you have a president who values disruption and unpredictability, especially on social media. And then, on the other hand, in the president's speech when he traveled to Saudi Arabia, spoke very clearly about not intervening in the internal affairs of other countries, but then just recently offered thoughts on exactly what should happen domestically inside Israel with respect to Prime Minister Netanyahu's ongoing judicial situation and the need to be in a courtroom. So, for each of you, how to reconcile or deal with an unpredictable executive in Washington, D.C., and balance the need for consistency in diplomacy. Richard, because I adore you, I adore all of you, but I'm going to go to you first, then Mona, then Rob to bring us home.
Man, that's a rough question. I'm glad I haven't upset you in some fashion. Look, I guess I would say this. There definitely is benefit from the standpoint of trying to convince the Iranians that continuing down nuclear reconstitution is a bad idea. If you're able to say that, if there's one thing the president's been very clear on, it's that nuclear and Iran are bad things, right? He's been clear on that since the first term. He's clear on that throughout the entirety of this one, but that he is also prepared to end it there. Right. If you are trying to convince the Iranians that there is an opportunity to make a deal and to, come forward and get sanctions relief and similar, I mean, this is a president who both can do it and is willing to do it and has the ability to drive his party to do it too. So, there is still a space here for the Iranians to explore if they wanted to do a deal. It will require them making sacrifices on their nuclear options that they've hitherto been unprepared to make. But let's go with an assumption that everything I said earlier is wrong, and that in fact that the strikes were able to destroy all those different bits of the program, or even less wrong, but just the things I asked questions about have answers, and those answers they're gone. All the various different bits of material and equipment are gone. If you're in that Iran situation, they might then see it's absolutely in their interest to strike a deal, and the fact that the president has been a little bit, flexible in terms of the means and how he'll try and do this, but has been resolute in what he wants to achieve, no nuclear Iran. That's a space. That's an opportunity that actually can be, useful here, especially if he is, someone who is still prepared to use nuclear or use military force to deal with the nuclear program. So there is an avenue here that is possible, that does give some hope, I think, that you could strike a deal. The problem that comes along with that comes back to the consistency point. And I couldn't agree more with Rob and Mona about, if you're going to strike a deal and then you're going to monitor a deal, you're going to have to spend a lot of time on it. And this isn't something that's going to be a one and done. It's not going to be something that you're going to be able to set aside, whether that's a military one and done or a diplomatic one and done as well. So it's it's one of those issues that if you're going to achieve your actual objectives, you have to be on it, and you have to try and make sure that all the implementation work goes along with it as well.
Mona?
So I think, let me pick up first on one of Richard's points, which is, I think this idea of incentivizing Iran to make a deal stands in contrast to the potential that if it sees no other option, it does indeed race to a crude nuclear device. And so, we have to understand that it may be that kinetic means on this don't get us to where we want to be. Arguably, you could make that argument. So let's just, for the sake of argument, say we all believe that a deal or diplomacy is really the way forward. But now we're faced with the problem of a disruptive executive and one that's kind of prone to inconsistency. And here I would say, well, let's play to something else. Let's play to a potential Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, I know I'm not the first to say this. This has been uttered many, many times, but let's play to another quality. right, of our executive, which is ego and a desire for success. And I think we would all agree that the success that's potential here would be enormous and unmatched, both in terms of addressing the Iran problem, addressing the issues, the Israeli-Palestinian issues, addressing issues with Lebanon, with Syria. And if all of these great wise minds come together and play that role, I think in Washington, I think that is critical. And I do think there are many, many in the region who also see it that way. And so I would say, let's make an appeal to ego. Let's make a campaign for President Trump getting the next Nobel Peace Prize.
Rob.
Okay, well, consistency. Consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds and small countries. Big countries don't have to be consistent. When you're a great power, you can have one policy toward a country near to you and a totally different policy to a different country very far away. That's why you are a great power. I can live with inconsistency. I think the world has learned to live with American inconsistency over the decades. President Trump just likes to telescope it inside, with a very, what he says on Monday, he changes on Tuesday, which is a rather difficult thing to grapple with, but it's the reality. Listen, I think I would hope that the Iranians would recognize what President Trump did not do by bombing Natanz, Isfahan, and Fordo, which is a very careful effort not to produce or trigger or execute regime change in Iran. A phrase that so far has not come up in today's conversation. Yes, new era of interstate conflict, but it was targeted very much to prevent to destroy Iran's nuclear infrastructure. Between that and a regime change is the potential for diplomacy. It may take, as I said earlier, it may take another military attack on nuclear infrastructure to affirm our commitment to prevent the nuclear piece. But by always targeting the nuclear piece, it only underscores that we're not targeting the regime itself. And I think that makes it possible to pursue diplomacy if we have a real investment of effort and creativity to achieve it. I hope the Trump people are invested in this. I think it's a huge opportunity. It could reap the sort of dividend that Mona just referred to. Most importantly, it could reap the sort of dividend we need and the region needs to get beyond the nuclear issue. It won't overcome all the problems of the Islamic Republic, but it will certainly overcome this one. And I think it will have derivative benefits for all the other issues that I talked about earlier.
Thank you so much. I want to thank all of our panelists today for this incredibly substantive and thought-provoking discussion. For you out there, if you're still tuned in and you liked what you heard, please check out the Washington Institute's website for daily analysis on this set of topics and many more from our deep bench of experts and analysts. And follow us on X, Instagram, LinkedIn, and other social media platforms not yet Truth Social to follow our experts on domestic and international media, podcasts, and other public forums. And sign up to receive our email updates about publications and upcoming events. Thanks for tuning in today. Be well.